Unfortunately, there's nowhere near as much information as there should be about French illustrator, caricaturist and artist Auguste Roubille. He was born in the Montmartre district of Paris in 1872, but there's nothing recorded about his early life or art training, or even if he undertook any. The best I can do is pick up his story around the turn of the century, when he would have been 28 years old, and his work began appearing in Parisian humour magazines, including the popular L'Assiette au Beurre, Le Rire and Le Sourire. And with these magazines forming his regular solid client base, from that point onward he never looked back. In 1900 he created a series of comical portraits of rulers and leaders from around the world, which was published by L'Assiette au Beurre as an album titled Le Musée des Cires. There was nothing particularly remarkable about his ability as a caricaturist, but the album sold in large numbers and raised his profile considerably. At this stage of his career, his style was broadly speaking flat with heavy calligraphic black line work, and revealed a strong influence of the cartoonist Caran d'Ache. And there was also some of his work, and particularly in the posters he created, which nodded in the direction of Toulouse-Lautrec. In 1906, the publishers of Le Rire launched a new magazine, Fantasio, and Rabil illustrated the cover of the first issue. This professional relationship would prove to be a significant factor in his success, and he went on to illustrate the cover of every issue up to 1933, other than a brief gap in 1914 when publication was suspended for a year due to the outbreak of war. Virtually every cover featured a young and old character, frequently the same ones, and each time with a new suggested narrative. This obviously had a significance similar to the use of the Punch character on the cover of the magazine of that name, but what that significance was, I have no idea. It's almost certain his poster work would have been created through traditional stone lithography, just as Lautrec's had been, but the magazine illustrations were more likely to have been pen and watercolour washes and printed in full colour. Having said that, I'm just guessing again based on inspection of the images at close quarters. From 1914 onwards, he created some particularly dark reflections on the horrors of the Great War, and when it was over he returned to his usual lighter approach. And in addition to his magazine work and occasional foray into advertising, he also illustrated several books in the 1920s. But the evidence reveals an altogether different approach, which was far from humorous and created with skillful expressive use of woodcut techniques. Rabil also had a successful career as a painter, mostly of landscapes, but illustration remained his strongest claim to fame, and he continued to be published into the early 1930s, at which point it seems to come to an end. The last dated example of his illustration I've been able to find was his final Fantasio cover in 1933. It's possible he retired at this point, as he would have just turned 60, but although I have no proof of it, I'm guessing he continued working as a painter, as he didn't die until 1955, when he was 82 years old. Joseph Lambert Wiertz was born in Aachen, Germany in 1888 and became better known by the name Juppwitz as one of the great modern German poster artists. Now, of course, he's almost completely forgotten. He attended the Aachen School of Applied Arts before relocating to Berlin to continue his art education. Witz's first poster appeared in 1913, but he fleshed out his sporadic income with some teaching work at a couple of Berlin art schools. However, he quickly acquired more clients and during the war worked for Newman Studios on publicity material for both automobile and aeronautic accounts. In the last year of the war, he stepped up his level of propaganda work, which culminated in this bizarre and rather fuzzy plea for German women to donate their hair. Apparently it really was used to make transmission belts. At the beginning of the 1920s, he started working for several German magazines, and in particular his association with Sport im Bild was creatively successful and enduring. Over a 7-year period, he created many well-considered and aesthetically attractive dynamic covers for them. Despite the miseries of life in Germany at the time, these images were celebrations of the modern age and a glamorous lifestyle very few could afford. But his popularity as a poster artist continued to grow throughout the decade, and increasingly corporate clients were queuing for his services. This gave him the opportunity to express himself using a variety of methods and media. Early on in his career, his style had been formal, angular and suggestive of woodcut, but throughout the 1920s and into the 30s, he worked increasingly with watercolour and linear inking. Even so, the graphic impact of his posters was always his first priority, and there were also a large amount of images in which he used opaque media, most likely gouache or tempera paint, which he frequently applied with an airbrush to spray large tonally coloured areas. A lot of his work in the 1920s was aimed at the female market, and although he didn't convert entirely to the dictates of Art Deco, he did absorb some of its characteristics. This continued into the 1930s, when he increasingly created posters promoting Germany as a tourist destination. Significantly, Hitler's National Socialist Party had come to power in 1933, and all graphic work was now under state control. Although in his case he wasn't required to produce directly propagandist material for the glory of the Reich, he was nevertheless expected to paint a significantly rosy picture of an idealised traditional Germany and its undoubted rural and historical appeal. His success was the equal of any of his contemporaries, including the far better remembered Ludwig Hohlwein. And in 1938, on the occasion of his 50th birthday, his hometown held a major exhibition of his work. Unfortunately, that was also the year that he suffered an injury which subsequently turned to sepsis, and in 1939, Juppwitz died in Berlin. Gladys Peto was born in 1890 in Maidenhead in south-east England, and at 18 she studied at the School of Fine Art there in 1908, followed by more study at the London School of Art in 1911. She began work as an illustrator in 1915, mostly for magazines including Woman and Home and The Sketch. And her professional relationship with The Sketch in particular would endure until 1928. Even though she was already working, in 1918 she decided she was in need of more tuition, so she undertook a course with John Hassel's Illustration Correspondence School. Although during her career her work appeared in a range of outcomes and formats, it was children's book illustration which was the core of her success and reputation. Many of these were also written by her, but she did occasionally illustrate the text of others too. Peto was a particularly skilled and sensitive inker, and in her monochromes she created visually absorbing images using light sinuous line with solid black areas and occasional use of extremely uniform cross-hatching to produce optical greys. And when working in full colour she added watercolour washes, usually as flat as that medium was capable of producing. Oddly, given the light touch and delicate nature of her images, she frequently favoured extensive use of solid black backgrounds. She married a military medical officer in 1922 and subsequently travelled with him to various Eastern Mediterranean and North African postings. And despite the difficulties of working such a long way from Britain, she somehow managed to sustain her career throughout her travels by posting her artwork to clients, most of whom were based in London. She even wrote and illustrated travel books about the places she lived, and the books were reasonably successful. Along with her more expected commissions, she also created a series of themed handkerchief books. Odd as it seems now, these were exactly what you'd think they were, packs of story illustrations printed on a collection of children's handkerchiefs. And in the 1920s and 30s they were very popular with the British public. And similarly, there were several sets of Gladys Peto illustrated tableware produced on the back of her popularity. In Britain she became quite a celebrity, and her high profile in the media of the day attracted advertising work, aimed usually at the mothers of young children. When her husband retired in 1939, they went to live in Northern Ireland, and she continued to work from there, mostly on bookwork, until 1946, when she retired from commercial illustration. She did continue to write and paint, although I've been unable to unearth any examples, and despite suffering a stroke in 1970, she carried on up to her death in 1977 at the age of 87. The melodramatic and stylish movie posters of Boris Grinsson were a familiar sight in French cities and towns for more than 40 years. But his work is largely unknown outside his home country, and not that well known even there. Not only is there not a particularly large amount of biographical information about him, but I can't find a single example of his work before 1939, so these images all come from later in his career, and we'll just have to imagine what he created before then. He was born in 1907 in the town of Pskov in western Russia, but his family fled to the relative safety of neighbouring Estonia during the turmoil of the 1917 revolution. He later moved to Berlin, where he took a course in applied arts and started to design film posters for a studio there. But as I've indicated, there's no evidence from this period. When Hitler came to power in 1933, Grinsson left Berlin on the next train to Paris, where he started creating posters for French subtitled versions of many Hollywood productions of the time. And he continued to create these vibrant posters throughout the decade, until the war broke out in 1939 and the Germans occupied Paris the following year. At which point he moved to a house in a remote rural location and kept a low profile up to the liberation of France in 1944. In the post-war period, French films started to be recognised for their cinematic qualities, and Grinsson created posters for them too. But it continued to be Hollywood's less thoughtful, bigger budget productions which remained his primary source of income. He always worked from supplied photographs, but although his images were largely representational, he wasn't what you would call a classic realist. His style recalled earlier graphic artists such as Ludwig Holbein in its use of posterized colour and highly dramatic lighting effects. What he actually painted with seems to be another well-kept secret, but given his fondness for dry brush strokes and graphic tonal effects, it was most likely to be gouache or tempera. Some of it features flawless tonal shading and looks very much like it was applied with an airbrush, but that's more speculation on my part. Although Grinsson certainly didn't invent the technique known as composite illustration, he used the device's visual potential with great creativity, and he was particularly adept at conjuring up and arranging different iconic elements of the film and the stars of the movie in his aesthetically balanced compositions. Throughout the 50s and 60s, Grinsson continued to create film posters, and he illustrated some of America's biggest blockbusters of the period. But by the time the 70s came around, studios were increasingly opting for photography in their posters, and as the decade progressed, he worked less and less until retirement. And Boris Grinsson died in 1999 in the town of Verneuil-les-Sablons at the age of 92. In a career of 50 years, he had created dynamic posters for almost 2,000 films. Thanks as ever for watching, and I hope you'll be back for more when the next batch is complete.